They didn't accidentally stamp black faces onto European money. They did it on purpose. And then, quietly, they stopped. Open a medieval coin book. Not the glossy museum brochure, the raw catalogs. You'll see it. Wide noses, full lips, tight curls under crowns, black rulers staring back at you from silver and gold struck in Europe itself. England, Germany, Italy, Spain, not Africa, Europe. Then flip the page. They're gone. No announcement, no explanation, just disappearance. That's the part nobody wants to explain, because coins aren't decoration, they're declarations. You don't put a face on money unless that face represents power, legitimacy, and rule. Coins tell you who was in charge when ink could still lie and paper could burn. Metal doesn't forget easily. So why did Europe once circulate money-bearing black rulers and later pretend it never happened? Here's the contrast nobody prepares you for. We're taught medieval Europe was isolated, white, inward-looking. We're shown castles, plague doctors, peasants in mud. Meanwhile, Africa is framed as distant, undeveloped, waiting to be discovered. But the coins tell a different story, a connected world. Trade routes stretching from West Africa into Europe, gold flowing north, ideas moving faster than armies, and ruling elites who did not all look the same. This wasn't fantasy, this was economy. From the early Middle Ages through the height of Moorish power, Europe depended on African gold, not metaphorically, literally. The gold standard of Europe was anchored to West African mines, Ghana, Mali, later Songhai. When African gold moved, Europe breathed. When it stopped, Europe panicked. That kind of dependence changes politics. It forces alliances, marriages, titles, and yes, representation. Some European mints didn't just trade with African powers, they honored them, they acknowledged them. They put their likenesses into circulation because refusing to do so meant economic isolation. That's the heroic struggle most textbooks skip. Europe wasn't always calling the shots. It was negotiating, learning, catching up. And when you're not the dominant force, you don't get to control the image. That's why early coins are honest. They show what power actually looked like at the time, not what later generations wanted it to look like, but power shifts. And when it does, images become dangerous. Here's the flip point. By the late medieval period, Europe begins consolidating. Trade routes reroute. Military technology changes. Centralized monarchies rise. The need to acknowledge African power fades, and the need to deny it grows. Because now, Europe wants a different story. A story where legitimacy is internal, where kings inherit greatness, not negotiated, where power is native, not imported through African gold and Muslim intermediaries. And that's when the coins change. Not overnight, gradually. Faces get stylized. Features soften. Ethnicity blurs. Saints replace rulers. Symbols replace portraits. And eventually, when portraits return, they're unmistakably white. That wasn't aesthetic. That was strategy. Because coins circulate more than armies. They move through every hand, rich, poor, literate, illiterate. If a black ruler stays on the money, the public never forgets who once mattered. So Europe rewrote the metal, and then came the cleanup. Later, historians reclassified the old coins. Exotic figures, allegorical Moors, decorative heads. Anything except what they clearly were, representations of real power in real time. Museums tucked them into side cases. Textbooks cropped them out. Auction houses described them vaguely. The public stopped seeing them altogether. That's how erasure works when you can't destroy the evidence. You bury it under interpretation. What makes this uncomfortable isn't just race, it's hierarchy. Because once you admit black rulers appeared on European money, you have to ask why. And that question pulls on threads. Europe doesn't like tug. It challenges the timeline. It disrupts the myth of isolation. It exposes dependence before dominance. And worst of all, it proves Europe once acknowledged African authority openly, not symbolically, economically. Money is belief pressed into metal, and belief changed. The irony? Those coins still exist, in vaults, private collections, museum drawers, waiting. They don't scream, they don't accuse, they just sit there, quietly asking the same question. If black rulers never mattered in Europe, why did Europe pay them tribute in silver and gold? And why did it stop? They want you to think those faces were symbols. They weren't. They were receipts. Because medieval Europe did not put imaginary people on its currency. Every face on a coin answered one question. Who holds power right now? Not myth, not metaphor, authority. So let's get straight to it. The black figures on European coins weren't random Africans. They weren't decorative Moors. They weren't saints abstracted into darkness. Many of them represented real African rulers, African-backed authority, or African-aligned power structures that Europe depended on. That's the part that changes everything. Europe's economy before modern banking ran on one thing, gold. And Europe did not control gold. Africa did, specifically West Africa, Ghana, Mali, Songhai. Regions so rich in gold that Arabic writers said nuggets were picked up like stones. Europe had silver, Africa had gold, and gold rules silver every time. So when African gold entered Europe through Islamic and Moorish networks, it came with terms, trade protections, diplomatic recognition, legal autonomy. In some regions, outright governance. In others, economic dominance so strong it dictated policy without needing armies. That's how power works when money talks first. Now zoom in. On Iberia and southern Europe. For centuries, Moorish authority wasn't foreign to Europe. It was European. Courts, judges, tax systems, currency. That's why coins minted in places like Al-Andalus didn't need to explain black faces. People already knew who held influence. Coins didn't introduce power, they reflected it. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Not all those black rulers lived in Europe. Some ruled from Africa while Europe bent economically, which means European mints stamped faces of people who didn't even need to be present to be obeyed. That's real leverage. That's why the faces appear confident, regal, calm, not caricatures, not enemies, equal or superior. Because at that moment in history, Europe was not dictating terms. Africa was. But dominance doesn't last forever. And when Europe's balance of power shifted, the first thing that became dangerous wasn't armies. It was memory. Because memory limits what lies you can sell later. You can't tell people Europe was always on top if their grandparents handled coins proving otherwise. So Europe didn't smash the coins. That would have raised suspicion. They simply changed what new money showed. This is the pattern you need to recognize. First phase, honest representation. Second phase, ambiguity. Third phase, erasure. Fourth phase, denial. By the time Europe entered its expansion era, those old coins had become a liability, proof that the racial hierarchy being sold was brand new, manufactured, fragile. So, scholars stepped in. They reinterpreted the imagery. They claimed black faces were symbolic of conquered enemies, or exotic lands, or abstract Moors representing darkness, not people. That explanation collapses under basic logic. You don't honor enemies on your currency. You don't place abstract darkness on money meant to inspire trust. You don't immortalize the powerless in gold. Money doesn't mock, it obeys, which is why the Uzdas. Disappearance matters more than the presence, because when black rulers vanish from coins, it aligns perfectly with when Europe begins rewriting its origin story, when Africa shifts from partner to problem, when blackness moves from authority to justification for exploitation. The imagery didn't change by accident. It changed to support a new world order, one where Europe must appear self-made, one where Africa must appear irrelevant, one where black authority must exist nowhere near the foundations of modern power, and coins were too honest to keep around. That's why modern museums talk about trade, but not tribute, influence, but not dependence, contact, but not control. They show the object, but bury the implication, because implication leads to questions, and questions lead to cracks. Here's the crack they're scared of. If Europe once acknowledged black rulers as legitimate enough to put on money, then race-based hierarchy is not ancient truth. It's a Khaldi, recent invention, and recent inventions can be dismantled. which is why the next layer matters. Because once the coins disappeared, Europe needed replacement imagery, new symbols, new saints, new faces to anchor legitimacy. And that's when something else strange happens. The black rulers don't just disappear from coins, they reappear transformed as demons, as servants, as shadows, as background figures in paintings. Same faces, new roles. So the real question isn't why black rulers were once on European coins. The real question is this: how did figures once worthy of gold become rewritten as something Europe felt comfortable stepping on? Watch how fast respect turns into distortion when power changes hands. Because Europe didn't just remove black rulers from coins, it replaced them with something safer. Once African authority no longer needed to be acknowledged, Europe had a branding problem. You can't build a new hierarchy if old symbols keep contradicting it. So the imagery had to evolve, quietly, systematically. This is where the pivot happens. Black figures don't vanish from European art. That's the trick. They get reassigned. Same time period, same regions, same faces. But now they're no longer centered, no longer crowned, no longer named. They move to the margins. A king on a coin becomes a servant in a painting. A ruler becomes a Moor with no identity. Authority becomes exoticism. Presence becomes background. That's not coincidence. That's narrative control, because erasing someone completely is risky. It creates gaps. People notice gaps. But reframing feels natural, invisible, acceptable. So Europe kept black faces visible, just stripped of power. Look at Renaissance art, court scenes, religious imagery. You'll see black figures everywhere, holding trays, standing behind thrones, playing instruments, guarding doors, rarely speaking, never ruling. Ask yourself, where did they come from? Because they didn't suddenly appear out of nowhere. Those figures are the after images of power that once existed, and the timing is telling. As European monarchies centralize, as expansion accelerates, as new racial theories start forming, black authority becomes intolerable. Not dangerous in reality, but dangerous to the story Europe is trying to sell itself. That story needs Europe to rise alone, needs whiteness to equal legitimacy, needs blackness to sit lower on the ladder. Coins couldn't support that lie anymore. Art could. And art is flexible. You can soften features, you can exaggerate others, you can strip names, you can change posture. A crowned head becomes bowed, a gaze forward becomes eyes down, a face once stamped in metal becomes paint on canvas, easier to reinterpret, easier to ignore. This is where the psychological shift locks in, because money teaches authority, art teaches hierarchy. Once black rulers were removed from currency, the next generation never saw blackness associated with command. They only saw it associated with service, otherness, spectacle. And once that association sticks, you don't need to explain it anymore. People internalize it. That's the fall most people miss. The disappearance of black rulers from coins isn't just about the past. It's about training the future. Training Europe to forget it ever needed Africa. Training the world to forget black authority ever existed at the top. Training black people themselves to question ancestral power. Because here's the brutal truth. If Europe had always been dominant, there would have been nothing to hide. The cover-up proves the vulnerability. Those early coins are cracks in the facade. Evidence of a time when Europe was not the center of the world and knew it. So they buried the memory, not the metal. They let collectors argue. Let scholars debate semantics. Let museums label things uncertain, all while the public moved on. And once the story solidified, the old coins could be dismissed as anomalies, curiosities, exceptions. But exceptions don't last 700 years. Patterns do. Which brings us to the final layer people avoid, because it's not just that black rulers disappeared from European money. It's that once they did, Europe began exporting its version of history everywhere else. Colonies, textbooks, museums, borders, belief systems. The same mechanism used to erase black authority at home was deployed globally. Control the image, control the memory, control the future. And it worked so well that today, even seeing a black face on a European coin feels shocking, suspicious, out of place. That reaction is learned, programmed, because the lie has been repeated long enough to feel like truth. But lies don't age well, evidence waits. Those coins are still there, silent, heavy, honest. They don't argue ideology. They don't shout. They don't explain themselves. They just exist. And existence is enough to undo a story built on forgetting. So the real issue isn't whether black rulers appeared on European coins. They did. The issue is what happens when enough people finally accept what that means. Because once you admit Europe once acknowledged African authority openly, everything downstream changes. The hierarchy cracks, the timeline shifts, the myth of isolation collapses, and the question stops being about the past. It becomes about the present. If history was edited this cleanly before, what else are you standing on right now that was built on erased faces? Here's the part nobody wants to sit with. Those coins don't just prove black rulers existed in Europe. They prove Europe once accepted black authority as normal. That's the threat. Because normalization is harder to undo than conquest. You can fight an enemy. You can't easily erase something people once accepted without question. That's why the Tao Ui disappearance wasn't loud. It was procedural. First, mints stopped naming rulers. Then they stopped showing faces. Then they stopped striking portrait coins altogether. Then, when portraits returned, they followed a new rule. Authority must look white. By the time modern Europe formed its identity, the visual language of power was already locked in. White face equals ruler. Black face equals something else. And that something else kept shifting depending on what Europe needed at the time. Exotic, servant, enemy, background, problem, but never ruler. Here's the key point most discussions avoid. Europe didn't erase black rulers because they hated black people. They erased them because they copied them first. African power systems, trade dominance, administrative models, even aesthetics fed early European development. Coins weren't just money, they were branding. And early on, Europe's brand was honest about where authority came from. Later, honesty became inconvenient. Because once Europe decided it was the center of the world, it couldn't admit it used to be peripheral. So the past had to be edited to match the present. This is why the coin evidence feels so jarring today. It doesn't match the story we were taught. And when evidence doesn't match the story, institutions protect the story, not the evidence. That's why museums talk around the coins instead of through them. That's why catalog descriptions hedge. That's why historians argue over semantics instead of power. They debate whether a face is African instead of asking why Africa mattered enough to be stamped in gold. That debate is intentional, because if you admit African rulers were acknowledged in Europe, you have to revisit everything that followed. You have to explain how acknowledgement turned into denial, how partnership turned into hierarchy, how authority turned into absence, and you have to explain it without pretending it was inevitable, because it wasn't. This wasn't destiny, it was decision-making, and decisions can be reversed. That's the danger. Those coins aren't just artifacts, they're leverage. They show that racial hierarchy is not ancient, not natural, not permanent. It was built recently, carefully, and aggressively, which means it can be dismantled just as deliberately. That's why the coins are minimized, because once you understand that Europe once needed Africa, economically, intellectually, symbolically, the entire power narrative flips. Europe didn't civilize the world. It learned how to rule in a world that already existed, and it learned that lesson early. That's why the transition from coin to canvas matters so much, from money to myth, from metal to memory, from ruler to stereotype. Because when you can no longer erase the evidence, you change how people feel about it. You make it seem strange, out of place, unbelievable. You train people to doubt their own eyes. So when someone finally sees a black ruler on a European coin, the reaction isn't recognition, it's confusion. And confusion is the goal, because confused people don't demand explanations. They defer to authority. They assume someone else has already figured it out. That's how silence survives centuries. But silence has limits. We're reaching one, because now the question isn't academic anymore, it's personal. If black authority was once acknowledged at the highest economic level in Europe, then its absence today isn't proof it never existed. It's proof it was removed, which means the final question isn't about coins at all. It's this: what happens when a generation stops asking whether black power belongs in history and starts asking who worked so hard to make it disappear in the first place? Here's the cleanest way to see the lie. Follow what replaces the coins. When black rulers disappear from European money, Europe doesn't leave power faceless. It fills the gap immediately. White kings, white saints, white lineage, white destiny. Authority gets racialized on purpose. That's the switch. Because if power is shown as white long enough, people stop asking if it always was. This is where myth hardens. European monarchies begin tracing their legitimacy backward, not through trade or alliances, but through ancient blood, divine right, sacred ancestry, God-chosen lines. The same period black faces vanish from coins is when Europe starts obsessing over purity, not coincidence. That obsession had a function. It erased evidence that power once flowed from outside Europe and from Africa in particular, because admitting that would collapse the fantasy of self-made dominance. So Europe did something subtle. It didn't just remove African authority from images, it rewrote time. Histories were reorganized to make African influence appear temporary, external, accidental, something that brushed Europe briefly, then vanished without consequence. Coins became exceptions. Moors became invaders. Trade became contact. Dependence became exchange. Language did the heavy lifting, because once you change the words, you don't need to destroy the objects. You just change how people read them. That's why today, even when the coins are visible, the meaning isn't. They're framed as curiosities instead of confirmations. But here's the part most people miss. You can't erase something unless it was strong enough to threaten you. Europe didn't remove black rulers from its money because they were irrelevant. It removed them because they were undeniable, and denial is always reactive. That's the tell. If black authority had never mattered, there would be no need to edit the record, no need to soften imagery, no need to debate semantics, no need to quietly remove faces from circulation. Power doesn't argue with fiction, it argues with memory, which brings us to the uncomfortable reality behind all this. The disappearance of black rulers from European coins wasn't the end of African influence. It was the moment Europe decided to hide its origins. And once a civilization hides its origins, everything built on top of that lie becomes fragile, because it's not grounded in truth. It's grounded in repetition. That's why these conversations feel explosive now, not because they're new, but because they were postponed. Those coins survived wars, regime changes, economic collapse. They outlasted the people who tried to minimize them, and now they're resurfacing in a world that's finally asking the right question. Not, were there black rulers in Europe? But, what kind of world do you build when you pretend you never needed them? Because that question doesn't stay in the past. It reaches forward, into modern hierarchies, modern economics, modern ideas of who belongs at the top. And once you realize how easily authority was edited out of history, you start wondering how much of what you see today is just another revision waiting to be challenged. Here's the bottom line. They hope you never connect. The coins disappeared before the ideology fully formed. That matters, because it shows intent. Europe didn't wake up one day racist and then look backward for justification. It looked backward first, edited the record, then built the ideology on top of the edit. The imagery changed first. The theory came later. That's how you know this wasn't ignorance. It was planning. By the time racial hierarchies were being written into science, the public had already been conditioned. They had spent generations seeing power represented one way, seeing authority look one way, seeing history framed one way. So when someone finally said, black people are naturally inferior, it didn't sound shocking. It sounded familiar, because the coins were already gone. This is why evidence like this is so dangerous today. Not because it changes one fact, but because it exposes the sequence, influence, acknowledgement, dependence, removal, justification. That order flips the entire moral narrative. It means European dominance wasn't destiny. It was a response to having once been behind. And people don't like being reminded they had to catch up. That's why the conversation keeps getting redirected toward abstraction, toward symbolism, toward endless debates about identity labels instead of power relationships. Because if you focus on labels, you don't have to explain why power was once shared and later monopolized. But here's what can't be argued away. Money is the most conservative institution in any society. It resists change. It preserves what works. You don't experiment with currency imagery unless the message is already accepted, which means when black rulers appeared on European coins, it wasn't radical. It was normal. That single fact should make you pause. Because if something once felt normal and now feels impossible, that tells you more about the present than the past. The erasure succeeded so well that even suggesting black authority in medieval Europe sounds unbelievable. That disbelief is the proof. The system worked. But systems only work until people notice the seams. And the seams are showing. Because once you recognize that authority can be removed from memory without being removed from reality, you start questioning everything else that feels natural. You start asking who decided, when they decided, and who benefited. And that's where this stops being about coins. It becomes about permission. Who gets remembered as builders? Who gets remembered as rulers? Who gets remembered at all? Those old coins answer that question honestly, which is exactly why they had to disappear. So now the final question isn't whether black rulers once appeared on European money. They did. The real question is what happens when enough people stop treating that as an anomaly and start treating it as a starting point. Because once you do, the entire map of history redraws itself. And suddenly, Europe's past doesn't look inevitable. It looks negotiated, borrowed, and quietly revised. So ask yourself, if the foundations were edited this thoroughly, how much of what you call common knowledge is just the final draft of a very intentional rewrite? Here's the sharpest cut. This isn't about proving black rulers existed. That's already done. This is about why Europe needed you to forget they ever did. Because memory limits power. If people remember that authority once moved across color lines, borders, and continents, then modern hierarchies stop looking permanent. They start looking conditional, temporary, man-made. And that's dangerous to anyone sitting comfortably at the top. So Europe didn't just erase images. It erased precedent. Because precedent creates expectation. If black rulers once belonged on coins, then black authority belongs in systems, in governance, in leadership, in legitimacy itself. And that idea had to die before expansion could live. That's why the disappearance of those coins lines up perfectly with Europe's outward push. As it began projecting power globally, it needed a clean internal story, one where dominance had always been its birthright. No debts, no teachers, no former equals, just destiny. That's the lie that still runs. And it's why this matters now. Because once you recognize how easily authority was removed from the past, you stop assuming its absence in the present is natural. You stop mistaking silence for truth. Those coins don't ask for belief. They demand explanation. And Europe never gave one. It just hoped time would do the work. But time doesn't erase evidence. People do, and people can also recover it, which brings us to what happens next. When the buried symbols resurface, when the old hierarchies start cracking, and when the question shifts from, did this happen, to why was it hidden so well? Because once you answer that, you're no longer just studying history. You're standing in the middle of its consequences. And that's where things get uncomfortable. Because if the past was edited this deliberately, then the future isn't fixed either. So the real issue isn't whether black rulers once shaped Europe. They did. The issue is what happens when that truth stops being whispered and starts being used. Here's the final compression before we move forward. Once you understand the coins, you understand the playbook. Europe didn't rise by pretending nothing came before it. It rose by selectively forgetting, by deciding which evidence stayed loud and which became quiet. Coins were too loud, too honest, too heavy with implications, so they had to go, not. Destroyed, disarmed. Because destruction invites investigation. Silence invites apathy. That's why this erasure worked so well. It didn't rely on force. It relied on time, institutions, and repetition. Generations grew up never seeing black authority linked to European legitimacy. So when modern power structures formed, they felt natural. That feeling is manufactured, and the coins prove it. Because here's the part that locks everything in. If black rulers once appeared on European money, then black authority isn't an anomaly in Western systems. It's a removed feature. That changes the entire frame. It means exclusion isn't tradition. It's editing. It means hierarchy isn't ancient. It's recent. It means inequality isn't inherited. It's enforced. And once you see that, the question stops being historical. It becomes structural. Because the same mechanism that removed black rulers from coins is still operating today. Different tools, same logic. Visibility first, then reinterpretation, then disappearance, then denial. You've seen this pattern everywhere once you know how to spot it. In textbooks, in media, in leadership imagery, in who is framed as foundational and who is framed as contributing. Coins were just the earliest, clearest example. And that's why they matter more than debates about identity labels or aesthetics. They're about permission. Who was allowed to represent power? Who was allowed to circulate? Who was allowed to be trusted? Money doesn't circulate doubt. It circulates belief. So when Europe once circulated black faces, it was circulating belief in black authority. When that stopped, belief was withdrawn, and belief shapes reality. That's the quiet violence of erasure. It doesn't attack bodies first. It attacks memory, expectation, possibility. By the time the world is reorganized, people think the outcome was inevitable. It wasn't. It was curated, which brings us to where this story has to go next, because coins are just one layer of evidence. Once you pull that thread, it leads somewhere much bigger, to maps that changed, to titles that shifted, to laws that quietly rewrote who could rule, own, inherit, and be remembered. The disappearance of black rulers from European money wasn't the end of the story. It was the signal that Europe was done acknowledging shared origins and ready to claim exclusive destiny, and that decision reshaped the modern world. So the next question isn't whether the coins prove black authority once existed. They do. The real question is, what else had to be edited to make sure that authority never returned? We're not at chunk 20 yet. And the next pieces make the coins look like the warning shot. Here's where this tightens. Once Europe removed black rulers from coins, it had to replace the proof with policy. Images alone aren't enough. You have to lock the story in legally. So power stopped being something you showed and became something you defined. New rules appeared. Who could inherit? Who could rule? Who could marry into legitimacy? Who counted as noble? None of this was accidental. These laws didn't just organize society, they filtered memory, because law doesn't just control behavior, it controls precedent. If black authority once existed, it had to be made legally impossible going forward, not argued against, eliminated as an option. That's why racialized nobility emerges after the imagery shifts. First, the coins disappear, then the gates close. This is the sequence nobody teaches. Visual erasure prepares the mind. Legal erasure secures the system. By the time Europe is fully centralized, black authority doesn't need to be disproven. It's simply rendered unthinkable. Outside the rules, outside legitimacy, outside history. That's the real kill shot. And once that framework is in place, everything else follows smoothly. Colonial expansion, racial classification, economic extraction, historical rewriting. Because the foundation is already laid, power now has a look, and that look has rules, which means when Europeans encountered African kings later, real ones, documented ones, they could dismiss them as tribal, local, uncivilized, not because they were, but because the definition of civilization had been redesigned. Coins told one truth, laws enforced another, and the law always wins in the long run. That's why modern historians struggle with the coins, Not because they're confusing, but because they contradict the legal narrative that followed. The coins belong to a time before the rules were rewritten, a time when authority wasn't yet color locked. That's what makes them dangerous. Because if authority was once fluid, negotiated, and transcontinental, then modern power structures are not natural outcomes. They're enforced outcomes, and enforcement always leaves fingerprints. Which brings us to the next layer, because once Europe finished rewriting legitimacy internally, it did something even more aggressive. It exported the rewrite. Not just armies, not just trade, but definitions. And once those definitions went global, the erasure stopped being regional. It became systemic. That's where this story turns from European history into world history. And that's why the coins were only the beginning. Here's the pivot to global scale. Once Europe locked legitimacy behind race at home, it exported that rule everywhere it went. This is critical. Colonial expansion wasn't just about land and resources, it was about standardizing the hierarchy. Europe didn't arrive asking who ruled here before. It arrived with a template already decided. White equals authority. Black equals labor. Anything else equals obstacle. That template only works if history supports it. So histories were rewritten in advance. African kings were downgraded to chiefs. Empires became tribes. Statecraft became custom. Law became tradition. Same playbook used on the coins, applied worldwide. And now the disappearance of black rulers from European money makes sense in hindsight. It wasn't an isolated edit. It was the prototype. Because you can't tell the world Europe is naturally superior if Europe once publicly acknowledged African authority. That evidence had to be neutralized first, then the rest could follow cleanly. Maps were redrawn to center Europe. Timelines were rearranged to make African civilizations feel early, distant, irrelevant. Achievements were detached from people and attached to regions or periods. Notice the pattern. The more Europe expanded, the quieter African authority became in the historical record. Not because it vanished, but because it contradicted the export narrative. That's why by the 18th and 19th centuries, when race science appears, it doesn't feel radical. It feels explanatory. It explains a world that was already staged to look unequal, and that's the trap. People mistake the explanation for the cause, but the cause came earlier. Coins, images, law, then ideology, in that order. Which means undoing the ideology requires revisiting the evidence that existed before it. That's why these coins matter more than debates about intent or prejudice. They're timestamps, proof that the hierarchy was not always there. And if it wasn't always there, it doesn't have to stay. That's the implication institutions don't want spreading. Because once people accept that authority was edited out of history, not earned out of it, the legitimacy of modern systems starts looking borrowed, conditional. And conditional systems provoke questions, dangerous ones. So the silence continues. But silence can't compete with artifacts forever, especially not when people finally start asking the right question. Not, did black rulers exist? But, why did Europe work so hard to make their authority impossible to imagine? Here's the pressure point. Once Europe exported its rewritten hierarchy, it had to police imagination. Because facts alone don't hold power. Belief does. So the system stopped people from even imagining black authority inside European frameworks. Not by banning evidence outright, but by surrounding it with doubt, question marks, academic fog, endless debate. That's why every black ruler in Europe becomes a controversy instead of a chapter. Ambiguity is the shield. If nothing is certain, nothing threatens the story. That's how those coins survive without changing the narrative. They're acknowledged, cataloged, and neutralized at the same time. Seen, but not felt. Known, but not integrated. Because integration would force re-evaluation, and re-evaluation destabilizes hierarchy. Here's the clean truth. Europe didn't fear African power once it surpassed it militarily. It feared African precedent. The idea that black authority once fit comfortably inside European systems is more dangerous than any army, because armies can be defeated. Precedent lingers. So the system trained people to see black authority as external to Europe, foreign, temporary, Impossible. Even when the evidence sits in European vaults, that training worked, which is why today, when confronted with these coins, the instinct is to explain them away instead of explain them fully. And that instinct is learned because the moment you accept the coins at face value, the story collapses, not gradually, immediately. If black rulers once belonged on European money, then Europe's self-image isn't original. It's edited, borrowed, curated for dominance, and dominance hates mirrors. So the coins are treated like anomalies instead of anchors, but anomalies don't repeat. Anomalies don't cluster. Anomalies don't align across regions and centuries. Patterns do. And the pattern here is simple. When Africa mattered economically, it appeared on Europe's money. When Africa needed to be subordinated, it disappeared. That's not mystery. That's motive. And once you accept motive, the conversation changes. Because now you're not asking if history was manipulated. You're asking how far the manipulation went. And that question doesn't stop at medieval coins. It moves forward into modern banking, modern borders, modern definitions of legitimacy, which means the real consequence of these coins isn't historical embarrassment, it's future reckoning. Here's the uncomfortable acceleration. Once Europe finished editing memory, it monetized the edit, because history isn't just taught, it's sold. Museums curated a version of the past that felt neutral but wasn't. Coins were displayed without context, African faces labeled vaguely, power stripped out of the explanation. The object survived, the meaning didn't. That's how control matures. You don't need to hide evidence if you can hollow it out. So by the time the modern world forms, people aren't told a lie outright. They're handed fragments, disconnected facts with no spine, enough truth to feel informed, not enough to feel threatened. That's why the coins sit behind glass instead of inside narratives, because narrative gives them force, and force creates consequences. Here's the key: shift. Once African authority was erased from Europe's self-image, Europe could now define Africa however it wanted, without contradiction. Weak, late, peripheral, always behind. No need to explain earlier parity, it had been edited away. This is why modern discussions about power feel so circular. People argue about capability without realizing capability was already proven and then erased. The coins are proof of capability, and proof is dangerous, because once you accept that African power once shaped Europe, you have to confront what replaced it. Not superiority, but consolidation. Not destiny, but design. That reframes everything. It means modern inequality isn't the result of ancient difference. It's the outcome of selective memory backed by institutions. And institutions don't admit that lightly. So the silence holds until pressure builds. And pressure is building now because the old justifications don't land anymore. Too many artifacts, too many inconsistencies, too many receipts that refuse to stay buried. Coins, maps, titles, architecture, language, they all point the same direction. Europe wasn't always the source. It was once the student. And students don't like remembering who taught them, especially when they later rewrote the syllabus. That's the tension we're sitting in, and it leads directly to the next layer. Because when you track where the erased authority went, it doesn't vanish. It relocates into myths, into monsters, into stereotypes, into everything Europe needed blackness to be, except powerful. That transformation didn't start with ideology. It started with money. And once you see that, the system stops feeling abstract. It feels engineered, still moving. Here's where the pattern locks in. Power doesn't disappear. It gets reassigned. Once African rulers were scrubbed from Europe's past, blackness had to be rebranded. You can't erase authority without replacing the Zal al-Adib image it leaves behind. So respect was swapped for utility, leadership for labor, sovereignty for symbolism. This wasn't random. It followed incentives. Europe's economy was expanding fast. Trade networks, banking systems, imperial competition, that growth needed justification. You can't dominate people you once depicted as rulers without rewriting who they are. So history was simplified. Coins stopped being evidence of rule and become curiosities. Titles stop meaning authority and become honorary. Faces stop being sovereign and become exotic. Same objects, new framing. That framing spreads outward, from museums to textbooks, from churches to courts, from art to language. Over time, the edit feels natural, obvious, like it was always that way. That's the real trick. Not erasing the past, but normalizing the rewrite. And once normalized, anyone pointing it out sounds disruptive, emotional, political, as if they're inventing something instead of restoring it. This is why the coins vanish quietly from public conversation. Not destroyed, not denied, just downgraded, because destruction raises questions. Downgrading feels academic, and academia is where edits get rubber stamped. By now, Europe doesn't need to argue superiority. It's implied, embedded, reinforced by centuries of selective storytelling that presents dominance as outcome, not strategy. But here's the pressure point. Coins don't lie. You don't mint faces of people you don't recognize as authority. You don't circulate their image unless the public accepts it. Money is trust-made metal, which means, at one point, Europe trusted black rulers enough to stamp them into daily life. That fact alone shatters the later narrative, so it had to be buried under layers of context, academic fog, racial ambiguity, anything that dulls the blade, because sharp history cuts. And the closer we get to modernity, the sharper it gets, because now, the question isn't whether African authority existed in Europe. It's why acknowledging it threatens the present. Here's the pivot nobody likes to admit. Once Europe entered full imperial mode, history stopped being descriptive and became defensive. Empires don't just conquer land, they conquer memory. By the 16th and 17th centuries, Europe needed a clean origin story, one where power flowed in a straight line from Rome to kings to empires. African rule inside Europe broke that line, so it had to be cut out, not debated, removed. That's why later historians obsess over genealogy but avoid iconography. Bloodlines can be argued, faces can't. A black ruler on a coin doesn't care about footnotes, so scholars shifted the battlefield. They argued semantics. They argued definitions. They argued that black didn't mean what it looks like, anything except the obvious. Because the obvious leads to an uncomfortable conclusion, Europe wasn't always the center. It learned. It borrowed. It absorbed leadership from outside itself, and that wrecks the fantasy of natural dominance. This is also why African presence gets framed as temporary, mercenaries, visitors, anomalies, never architects, never originators, never sovereigns. Temporary people don't threaten permanent stories, but coins are permanent artifacts. They outlast empires. They sit in drawers, vaults, collections, waiting. And every time one resurfaces, it reopens a question Europe already decided to close. Who was allowed to rule? Who was allowed to be remembered? The disappearance isn't accidental. Here's the hard truth. History didn't lose black European rulers. It outgrew its tolerance for them. Once racial hierarchy became the operating system, the past had to be rewritten to match it. You can't justify global domination while admitting black authority once sat at the center of European power, so the record was adjusted after the fact. Coins stopped being shown. Portraits stopped being reproduced. Descriptions got softer. Faces got vaguer, not erased overnight, neutralized over time. This is why modern textbooks feel clean. Too clean. They present Europe as if it evolved in isolation, guided only by internal genius, no African hands, no external leadership, no inconvenient interruptions. But the material record doesn't agree. Coins don't care about ideology. Metal doesn't revise itself. Every black ruler struck into European currency proves one thing. Race-based supremacy is a late invention, not an ancient truth. And once that invention became useful, the past had to be reshaped to protect it. That's the point. History wasn't forgotten. It was edited. Here's what seals it. If black rulers were mythical, there'd be no need to explain them away. But historians didn't deny the coins. They reclassified them. Suddenly, black faces became symbolic. Crowns became exotic decoration. African features were blamed on artistic style, not biology. That move matters because once you admit those rulers were real people, the entire racial timeline collapses. Europe didn't start white and stay white. Power wasn't always tied to skin tone. Authority moved across cultures before it was locked behind race, so the coins were reframed as anomalies instead of evidence. That's not scholarship. That's damage control. And it explains why these coins never make it into classrooms. They don't fit the linear story Europe tells about itself. Poor to powerful, dark ages to enlightenment, white to white. Black rulers break that arc. They prove Europe's past was shared, contested, and African influence long before colonial narratives hardened. Which brings us to the final move. Because once images couldn't be denied, the next step was simpler. Stop minting them. Once black rulers stopped appearing on coins, something else happened. Their names vanished, chronicles quietly. Swapped identities. African-sounding names were Latinized. Titles were reassigned. Lineages were uncertain. Same reigns, same dates, different faces. This wasn't about confusion. It was about continuity. Coins circulate, images stick, names fade. So Europe kept the power structure but stripped the visuals. Kings remained, authority remained, but blackness was removed from the record. And here's the key point. You don't erase something that never mattered. You erase what threatens legitimacy. Because if people see that medieval Europe once accepted black sovereignty, then modern racial hierarchies look artificial, recent, manufactured. That's dangerous. So history tightened its borders. Race hardened. Whiteness became default. Anything outside it became foreign, even when it was already there. By the time printing presses standardized textbooks, the cleanup was complete. Coins were archived, images mislabeled, narratives sealed, which means this story survives only where revision was hardest. Metal, stone, artifacts too stubborn to rewrite, and that leaves us with one unavoidable question. If black rulers were removed from Europe's money, what else was removed from its memory? Here's what ties it all together. Coins don't lie by accident. They lie only after power changes hands. When black rulers ruled, they were shown. When they lost power, they were scrubbed. Not smashed, not destroyed, quietly retired. Because destroying evidence raises alarms. Archiving it buries truth without noise. Europe didn't forget black rulers. It outgrew the need to admit them. Once colonial expansion began, Europe needed a story where black authority never existed at home. Only out there. Only conquered. Only subordinate. So the timeline was edited. Blackness was pushed south. Authority was pushed north. History was redrawn to match empire. That's why the coins feel shocking today. They contradict everything you were taught. Not with opinion, but with metal, with dates, with official mint marks. They expose a Europe that was once racially fluid, politically diverse, and far less white than later centuries claimed. And that truth had to disappear for modern Europe to make sense of itself. Which brings us to the final point. The question is no longer did black rulers exist in Europe. The evidence already answered that. The real question is, why are we only allowed to discover them now? Because timing matters. History gets rediscovered only when it's no longer dangerous. For centuries, admitting black rulers in Europe would have collapsed the entire racial hierarchy that justified conquest, extraction, and domination. You can't argue inherent superiority while sitting on evidence of black sovereignty stamped into your own currency. So the truth stayed locked away. Now, centuries later, the stakes feel lower. Empires have already taken what they wanted. Borders are drawn. Wealth is concentrated. The story has already done its work. That's why museums can quietly display a coin here. Why academics can publish a paper there. Why discoveries are framed as curiosities, not corrections. Controlled release. Enough truth to appear honest. Not enough to force accountability. Because once you accept that black rulers govern parts of Europe, everything else unravels. The myths crack. That Europe was always white. That blackness only arrived as labor. That power has a natural color. None of that survives contact with evidence. Coins are official documents. They tell you who had authority, who collected taxes, who commanded loyalty. and Europe minted black authority until it decided that image no longer served its future. So they didn't erase the rulers themselves, they erased the memory of them. That's the trick, not silence, distortion, delay, discomfort. And now you're standing at the edge of that discomfort because once you see the pattern, statues, manuscripts, coins, portraits, you realize this isn't about one forgotten ruler. It's about a system that edits reality to protect power, which means the final choice isn't academic, it's personal. You can treat this as trivia, or you can recognize it for what it is, a warning. If history can erase kings, it can erase anyone, and it will, unless someone keeps asking why the evidence keeps disappearing.